The mountains do not like strangers. They tolerate them, puffing, red-faced creatures crawling over their slopes like ants. But patience has its limits. The team of 4 researchers, geologist Louise, biologist Ted, experienced climber Jimmy, and young intern Chris, had felt it since the beginning of their ascent. The air was thick and motionless, as if the very atmosphere was compressing in protest. Pressure. That was the word spinning in Louise's head as she pushed through the dwarf pine thickets. Not atmospheric pressure, but something else, ancient and sentient. "I think we're lost," Jimmy said grimly, stopping to wipe sweat from his forehead. His GPS, usually as reliable as a Swiss watch, was showing gibberish. "It can't be," Ted objected, taking off his glasses and wiping the lenses. "We followed the route exactly. This is an anomaly." Chris, the youngest and not yet skilled at hiding fear, nervously fiddled with his backpack strap. "Maybe we should go back. This place feels wrong." He was the first to see it. The clearing. It was unnaturally round and perfectly flat, as if paved by a giant roller. Not a blade of grass, not a bump. Only smooth grey, polished-looking earth. And in its very center stood a chair, a simple wooden chair, a back, 4 legs, a seat. But in this wild, primordial wilderness, it looked more alien and frightening than any mythical monster. It was old, you could tell by the style and rough workmanship, but perfectly clean. Not a speck of dust, not a spot. It seemed as if it had just been brought out from a sterile workshop. Everyone froze at the edge of the clearing, stunned by the absurd sight. "What the hell?" Jimmy whispered. Louise, driven by scientific curiosity, took a step forward. "Be careful," Ted warned her, but she was already approaching the center. On the ground, next to one of the chair's legs, lay a scrap of yellowed, thick paper. Louise bent down and picked it up. The inscription was written in an old-fashioned, elegant hand, the ink browned with age. "The mountains are tired. Sit down," she read the note aloud. Her voice sounded deafeningly loud in the oppressive silence. Chris snorted. The laugh was nervous and out of place. "Well, that's hospitable. I'm tired. My legs are killing me." He shrugged his backpack off his shoulders. "Chris, no!" Jimmy shouted sharply, but it was too late. Tired, exhausted from the multi-day climb, seeing only a strange but tempting opportunity to rest his aching feet, Chris stepped onto the perfectly level ground and sat down on the chair. The world froze. The very second his body touched the wood, the forest around the clearing fell silent. Absolutely. The last sounds disappeared. The chirping of birds, the chirring of insects, the rustle of leaves on the sparse trees at the edges. A silence fell, thick and heavy like cotton wool stuffing the ears, and then a hum came from underground. Low, deep, vibrating, it came not from one point but from the very soil, from the bedrock beneath it. It was the sound of a waking giant, the sound of moving strata. "Chris, get up, now!" Jimmy yelled, rushing onto the clearing, but Chris couldn't get up. His eyes widened in horror. I can't. It's holding me." The chair began to move. Slowly, with a vile, grinding sound, it began to sink into the earth, not falling into a hole, but pressing into the stone slab that lay beneath the thin layer of soil. Wood and stone merged into one. "Hold him," Louise screamed, grabbing Chris under the arms. Ted and Jimmy grabbed the back of the chair. It was useless. The chair sank with an inexorable mechanical force. It seemed as if the entire mountain was pressing down on it from above. Chris screamed, his fingers digging into the wood of the seat, his legs dangling helplessly in the air. The earth was receiving him like a soft bed, but it was the bed of a grave. "Don't let go. Hold on." Jimmy growled, bracing his feet, but his rubber soles slid on the smooth, glass-like surface of the clearing. The chair went down, up to his knees now, up to his chest. Chris's face was contorted into a mask of inhuman terror. He looked at them, his comrades, pleading for help they could not give. "Louise!" His voice was a desperate scream, and then he was gone. The chair disappeared under the ground, and the grey polished surface of the clearing closed over him, leaving not a crack, not the slightest irregularity. As if nothing had ever been there, the three remaining stood, breathing heavily in the deafening silence, unable to comprehend what had happened, and then they heard it, from underground. From the very depth where the chair had gone came a sound, a loud, drawn-out, satisfied sigh. It was like the sound a person makes when sinking into a hot bath after a long day. A sigh of relief, of enjoyment. And in that sigh was the entire essence of the mountains, their ancient, unfathomable fatigue, and their hunger. The silence was replaced by a soul-chilling whisper that seemed to come from the very air, from the rocks, from underground. It was on the edge of hearing, composed of creaks, rustles, and barely perceptible voices merging into one word, one image, hammering into the consciousness. Come. Come to me. Rest. Jimmy, pale as a sheet, took a step back toward the edge of the clearing. We have to get help. But his legs wouldn't obey. They were like cotton wool, an inexpressible fatigue, which he had until now held back by willpower, washed over him in a wave. Every muscle burned, begging for cessation, and the whisper promised peace. Just step onto that smooth surface, and all the torment would end. He reached for his water flask, but his hand shook so much he couldn't undo the clasp. I can't, he whispered, and his eyes held the same despair that had been in Chris's a second before. Louise looked at the perfectly clean earth. The scientist in her was dead. Only an animal, primal anxiety remained. It's not just a chair, she said, and her voice was alien. It's an offer, an invitation. Ted, usually calm and rational, stood with his hands clutching his head. We didn't see anything. We saw nothing. This didn't happen. An avalanche took him. A rockfall, anything, but they knew. They all knew. They had seen the mountains swallow their friend and sigh with satisfaction. Sit down. The whisper grew more insistent. It vibrated in their bones, hammered into their brains. The fatigue they felt was no longer their own. It was being poured into them, pumped in like poison to weaken their will. Jimmy took a step, not back toward the forest, but forward toward the center of the clearing. His gaze was glazed. Jimmy, no! Louise cried, grabbing his jacket. He recoiled as if from fire. Let go. I just want to sit down. For a minute. Just 1 minute. He looked at the spot where Chris had disappeared with such longing, as if he saw not a deadly trap, but a heavenly oasis. And Louise understood. The most terrible trap is the one the victim walks into themselves, because they no longer have the strength to resist. The mountain wasn't killing. It was offering. And its offer, after days of exhausting travel, was the most tempting thing in the world. Rest, peace, an end to the struggle. She looked at Ted. He was crying, quietly, silently, staring at the ground. His will, his scientific rationalism, all was broken, and the whisper grew, becoming a melody, a lullaby, calling them into the embrace of eternal sleep. Louise felt her own fatigue turning into an irresistible heaviness. Her eyelids felt leaden, her legs buckled. The thought of taking one more step through this wild forest seemed like torture, and just a few meters away was peace, perfect, clean, silent. She looked at her comrades, at Jimmy, who was almost succumbing to the call, and at the broken Ted. And then she did the only thing she could. She did not fight. She did not run. She stepped onto the clearing. Louise, Ted croaked. She walked toward the center, toward the spot, feeling with each step how the fatigue was leaving her body, giving way to a strange, empty calm. She turned to them. Run, she said quietly, while you still can. Then she approached the very spot and slowly, almost ritualistically, knelt, then sat on the ground, crossing her legs as if she were going to meditate. She did not touch the chair. It was gone. but the invitation was addressed to everyone. She closed her eyes, waiting, but nothing happened. She was just sitting on the cold, smooth earth. The whisper died down. The pressure eased. Jimmy and Ted stared at her in astonishment. Had she tricked the mountain, refused the invitation but accepted it in her own way? And then Louise understood. She was not a victim. She was a guest, one who had accepted the invitation but refused the offered seat. She had shown respect, and the mountains respect strength, even the strength to surrender, but on one's own terms. She opened her eyes and looked at her friends. Her gaze was clear and lucid. "He is home," she said quietly. "Chris is home, and the mountains are no longer hungry. Today." She stood up, and her movements were full of a strange, borrowed energy. She walked to the edge of the clearing, took Ted's hand, then Jimmy's. Her touch was cold, but firm. "Let's go," she said, "before they get tired again." And they left, without looking back, leaving behind the perfectly round clearing guarding its terrible secret. But Louise knew. She was marked. She had been a guest in the House of the Mountains, and one day, when her own strength finally ran out, she would remember the invitation, and this time she would accept it with gratitude.